Hi everyone, I'm Sean Kidney. I'm the CEO of the Climate Bonds Initiative. Unfortunately, we've had a few little challenges of our system getting going. Thank you for your patience. We will now get started with the conference sessions. I'm talking to you from my kitchen. We're still living in a time of pandemic crisis. We're living in a time of lots of crisis. I've just had a tweet from a friend of mine in California who tells me that she's writing climate change policy as she watches the ash gently fall outside her window. The fires are raging across California. We've had extraordinary floods in Bangladesh in the last few weeks. We've had a year of crisis after crisis, unprecedented around the world. And we now live in a crisis of COVID, which is a pandemic rooted in pathogens jumping between species because of environmental degradation, exactly as predicted by the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change for the last 25 years, exactly as predicted. This is the first of our 21st century climate crises. We are going to get many more of these. Fires, droughts, floods, wars, pandemics. There are two things we have to learn from this. It is time to transition. One, we have taken a long time to get to this point in our history when now we have to act so fast, so quickly to be able to avoid utterly catastrophic climate change coming our way. Two, we have to prepare for volatility, for crisis, for pandemics, for floods, for fires. We have to prepare our societies to become more resilient. We have to learn from this particular crisis that we're in at the moment about what we have to do. It's not just about coastal protection and stopping floods in Bangladesh or Vietnam or the Nile Delta or the Netherlands. It's also about making sure our health systems are ready. Access to health for all is now a critical climate resilience investment we have to make. Preparing our societies for volatility. Societies that are highly unequal seem to collapse more frequently than societies that are equal with good social cohesion. That's a clue as to the sort of things we have to invest in going forward. Today, we start our Climate Bonds Green Transitions Conference. Thank you for joining us. Our job is to talk about how we're going to advance this particular extraordinary challenge that we face. How we're going to make green finance, climate finance, transition finance work for us and help us make that transition to a different kind of world, a world where we can have some confidence that our children will have a reasonable future. We have an enormous list of speakers coming up. We're privileged to have the support of key sponsors. I need to tell you that we've been extraordinarily lucky to get Credit Suisse, Amundi Asset Management, BNP Paribas, the Luxembourg Green Exchange, Goldman Sachs, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, JP Morgan, HSBC, Refinitiv as key sponsors for this conference. Thank you, folks. This wouldn't be happening without you, and we understand your commitment to growing this market as a solution for the climate challenges we face. Thank you also to Lixor, Moody's, Invesco, Allianz Bernstein, BBVA, Mizuho, and the Green Finance Center in Nur-Sultan in Kazakhstan for their support. They've helped with many things, including providing translations. This conference is being translated into 5 other languages. If you look across your screen, you will find a translations button. You can, if you want to test your Chinese skills and you're living in New York, turn on the Chinese. Or you can tell your friends in China they can listen in Chinese, not have to put up with the difficulties of English. I want to also thank all the people that we've worked with over the years to grow this market. This is, you may not know, the 10th anniversary celebration for climate bonds. This conference is not going to be a celebration. This conference is about the work we have to do. But on the 24th of November this year, we'll be having a special webinar event focused around the climate bonds work globally. Please do join us. It'll be free for all. I do want to talk today, though, about the 10 years and what's happened and the 10 next steps. Before I get into that, a couple of housekeeping events. There is a Q&A function available inside the WOVA app. Ask questions, people will respond. Some of them we will take up and put in the panel sessions. Someone is monitoring as I speak, so please do free to go ahead and ask questions. Jump in and answer them if you have an answer, particularly my friends in investment banks. Dive in and talk to people. I've mentioned simultaneous translations. Again, there are 5. Use them. All of these sessions will be recorded. They'll be available a day after the recording. They'll be available in the WOVA app right through till December. You can watch them again and again if you're that keen. But more to the point, when you're dialing in from time zones around the world, you will be able to connect with the videos you've missed or the sessions you've missed afterwards. And we'll be reminding people in the app that you can do that. Finally, tweet. Hashtag CBI conference or CBI CONF 20. CBI Conf 20. That's the hashtag. Please do tweet if you're a Twitter user. Again, I'm Sean Kidney. I'm the CEO of the Climate Bonds Initiative. I'm backed by a big team. I want to make a special thanks before I get started to Alicia Bastos, who's our head of events, who has been working tirelessly for months to get this program going, and to the big team she has behind her. I won't go into all the names now, but we are incredibly privileged at the Climate Bonds Initiative to have such a fantastic team. I do also want to just put out a marker to Nancy Saich, who's going to speak on our next panel in a few minutes, and the European Investment Bank, who were the pioneer issuer of green bonds called climate awareness bonds in 2008, who kicked off this whole story. Thank you, EIB, and thank you for your continued work to issue in the market. The other development banks need a shout out too. World Bank, who pioneered independent reviews. The IFC, who created the first benchmark size green bonds that cracked open the market for corporates. KfW, with their huge program that opened up the German market. Sovereign issuers. And today I want to mention Kazakhstan, because they've had their first green bond just recently, the latest country to join the club. We have the Green Finance Center of Nur Sultan as one of our sponsors, and they've been working for 2 years now to get this to happen. It started. The Damu Development Fund has issued a $500 million green bond in local currency, Tenge, to finance renewable energy by small business. It's very cool. Investors, banks, our very good friends on the Green Bond Principles, EXCOM, and ICMA, the International Capital Markets Association, and regulators have got us here today. It's been 10 years since we set up the Climate Bonds Initiative. As I said, we're still having a few problems. We haven't actually won on climate. Emissions did flatline last year, which is actually extraordinary. This year, they've gone down, or they look like they're going to go down, according to the OECD and our International Energy Agency, by 8%. Only 8%? I would have thought with the sort of cessation of aviation transport work over the last few months, it would have been more than that. It's only 8%. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change tells us that to meet our climate goals, which essentially is about avoiding catastrophic climate change, not stopping climate change, we have to get down emissions roughly 7.6% per annum, year in, year out, for the next 10 years. What we've done this year is what we have to do every single year. How are we going to do that really is the tough question for today and the next 2 days of our conference. We know that climate impacts have started, those fires in California. We know that policy action still remains patchy. Science is ignored, the very thing that gave us the wealth and the health and the energy that underpins our societies continues to be ignored in so many countries by our leaders. It's like we've gone to the doctor to ask advice. They've said we've got cancer, but we're still smoking. Why stop? Why bother with the cancer treatment? That's what's going on in the world. It's not good. But we have had some wins. We've had a huge win in one sector, renewable energy. We've managed to get the cost of renewable energy down dramatically thanks to strong government action. Let's be clear why this has happened. Thanks to Germany with its feed-in tariff in 2001, and then China with its mass procurement in the years after. Volume production of solar has gone up and the price point has gone down, and the same has happened with wind around the world. We haven't exactly won the energy battle yet, but the end of the tunnel is in sight. That's great. We can do this again with strong government action and volume procurement with things like electric vehicles and hydrogen and steel and cement. We'll come to that later. We have investment belief that the transition is working, is happening, is starting. We know that the Paris Climate Change Agreement made a huge change in the understanding of investors about the likelihood of policy action. Change is a coming, is what everyone now thinks. It's only when. If it's not in November, an election in the US, it'll be 4 years later. It's when, not if. Now that makes a big difference to investment policy. It makes a big difference to corporate plans. It makes a big difference to all of us as we start thinking about our future, because we're now thinking differently. We have proof as well that if we bring green deals to market, investors will invest. We've seen $1 trillion of green bonds issued. $1 trillion. That is a win, folks. We've seen pricing appear. Thank you, Germany, issuing a conventional and a green bond on the same day. Bingo, a little bit of pricing difference at minus interest rates, for goodness sakes, let alone all the other issuers that have been reporting that recently. It's not sentiment. Green bonds are a premium product on the secondary market. They hold their value in downturns, better performance. It's a hard-head decision. Regulators are acting. The Network for Greening the Financial System has launched its scenario report. It has said that for regulators, the past is not an adequate guide for the future anymore because of the world we're going into. So they've done a paper on different scenarios of what the future will look like to guide regulators around the world in their thinking. We'll hear more about that on Thursday. This is an incredible sea change. This is the intellectual high ground of economics that's been won by our regulators. Development banks are pushing green. The European Investment Bank is now called a climate bank. The IFC is bringing out a 30-30 policy to try and push all its commercial bank holdings around the world by 2030 to be doing 30% green lending. Hurrah! The ADB is rolling out green catalyst funds. The EBRD is moving to 50% climate-related lending. Now for the national development banks. We have hundreds of these around the world. They too can shift. We have a proof of concept. That's what the green bond market is. It doesn't solve anything. It's only part of the solution, but it changes the terms of discussion. That's why it is so critical and so important. It creates enthusiasm and it creates opportunity that we need, a sense of opportunity to shift our world. Now the agenda. 10 steps for the next 10 years. We need to get tough about transition, number one. We've been weak. We've let the steel industry continue to pollute. We haven't been tough on cement, worth 8% of global emissions, for goodness sake. When we have the solutions available to us, we know there is low carbon cement available now that we can use. We know that we can get zero carbon steel very quickly. ThyssenKrupp, SSAB, Baowu in China have all announced plans to do this, but it's not fast enough. We can make it faster. We need to be accelerating the closure of our fossil fuel sectors. Coal needs to be bought up and then closed down. Not straight away, we can't do that financially. And we've got to keep the lights on, but we can accelerate that transition with innovative solutions that you will hear about in our session tomorrow. But we need to get tough. It's been too soft what we've been doing so far in terms of the high carbon industries and the challenges in places like plastics. 2, we have to build resilience into everything. Unfortunately, we now do have a world where climate volatility is the norm. We have a world where this will get worse quite fast. Not just pandemics, but all sorts of impacts. That does require us to adapt our infrastructure. That does require us to learn to make our societies more resilient. Look to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. They are all indicators of resilience. But we need to do this double time. 3, we have to make things simple. This is especially important in financial markets, where commoditization, clear rules drive growth. But frankly, it's important for citizens too. Do you know, as you're walking around the street, what infrastructure is future fit? Your subway system is. Your car park is not, at least when it's got fossil fuel vehicles in it. What buildings are energy efficient and which ones are not? All of these things are what financial markets need to do. The work we've been doing on taxonomies in China, in Europe, now in Colombia and other countries, is about trying to make it simple. It doesn't mean the job of figuring out what's got to be done is easy, but then neither is the job of building an electric car. What we're doing is creating the electric car. The user, however, just gets in, presses the go button and drives off. That's what financial markets need. A taxonomy, definitions, clarity about what we have to do to meet our Paris Agreement targets that allows us to do that. That's our job. We're making a pledge at the Climate Bonds Initiative to work hard to deliver simplicity of solutions. Complexity under the hood, of course. Investors. Number 4, and now I start talking about what we need to be doing in different sectors. Investors need to shift from allocating within the pool they have, from pushing their companies to change to the next step, which is working to create the future they need, we need, for sustainable investments. We need to start getting aggressive with our corporate holdings, with our sovereign holdings, and saying, this is what we need to see, create the investment and we will invest. Build railways, here's a framework to do it. we will invest. Green buildings, here's a framework for doing it, and we will invest. Don't get me wrong. I don't want my pension fund to sacrifice returns unnecessarily. I don't think it has to. I think this is about the partnership between the public sector and investors to deliver long-term investable propositions that will pay my pension when I finally retire in 25 years' time or so, but also address the challenges of the planet. We can get a reasonable return, particularly in these times when returns are so low in Europe, in Japan, in the US, and we can address the challenges that we face the planet at the same time. But we do need governments, cities, national governments, states, to work with investors to create this vast pipeline of low carbon investments and resilient investments that we need. Not just in rich countries, this applies to Lagos, to Jakarta, to Nairobi, to Mumbai, all around the world. This can be done. We'll talk about that later too. By the way, don't underestimate the benefit of investors pushing sovereigns to issue green bonds with the reporting and transparency requirements to allow you to see where the money's going and to vote with your checkbooks in that particular fashion. We're seeing that already with the incredible demand for sovereigns in Thailand, in green and sustainable sovereigns in Thailand, in Germany, in other places. But there's work to be done. Citizens, imagine the future you want for your children. Put pressure on your pension funds, your banks and corporations. But remember, we have to imagine a world we want to live in. We can create that future and we can create a living from it if we're clever here. Sustainable, clean, inclusive, equitable. Demand green finance. Central banks and regulators move beyond transparency. That's been a good first start with the Task Force for Climate Finance Related Disclosure and the disclosure guidelines and regulations. METI in Japan was the first to institute these. The European Commission is making a regulation about it. We now need action. You are not going to ensure stability of financial markets going forward simply by providing transparency. You are going to have to shift the deck chairs. You are going to have to get people to be more active in their portfolio realignment. You're going to have to push, and you'll probably need incentives, as the People's Bank of China has been introducing and tracking. It's time to exercise hard power you have, but the soft power you have as well, to ensure that the financial sector does actually shift at the speed that we needed to shift. For governments, the big one. Engineer the industrial and urban transitions we need. How do you do that? Planning, pipeline. Have you got a green infrastructure pipeline that you're advertising to the world for the next 15 years? Have you actually spelt out? You don't even need to identify exactly how to do it at this stage. That can be the collaboration. This can work in Lagos, and we'll have the governor later this afternoon of Lagos on this forum. Think about convening task forces in essential areas that we have to move forward on. The cement industry. We have cheap cement available now that is low carbon. It's simply not being rolled out. A task force on the built environment would flush this out. Think about shipping. We could shift to all new vessels being low carbon by 2030, but it will need collaborative action amongst governments. A task force could pull that together. We do need large-scale volume of green hydrogen by 2030, which will allow us to unlock zero carbon in the steel industry and other sectors. Work together to achieve that. Thank you, Germany, for your recent announcement in this area. But think internationally too. We won't get enough volume of green hydrogen unless we're working across borders. Think about transport. The US and Europe need a task force looking at how to match what China has done in high-speed rail. And while you're at it, as you build that high-speed rail, then axe the slots for short-haul flights, unless they're using battery power. Learn from what the French government has done with KLM Air France, where bailouts are dependent on not competing with high-speed rail. And why aren't we saying that all new cars should be zero tailpipe emissions by 2030? It is time for transition. For banks, we have the capital. It's sitting in unbelievably cheap pools of capital. German bunds, Japanese government bonds. It needs to be deployed into places where it'll earn more return. We have about $90 trillion we have to invest over the next 30 years to achieve this transition, especially in the next 10 years. There is one group that does this, bankers. We need you, bankers. We need you with a mission to grow a vast green bond, climate bond, and transition bond market, and equities, and every instrument, and loans for that matter. We're depending on you. We're not going to be able to do this unless bankers do their part. Sure, it started, but it's still tiny. It's still tiny. Make the deals happen, please. Transition is what we need now. It's time. Over to you. I'm now going to switch machines so I can introduce our panel. Thank you for your patience, everyone. Thank you, panelists, for your patience. Okay, I'd now like to welcome my fantastic panelists for this session. We have four great friends. Nancy Saich, who's the Chief Climate Change Expert for the European Investment Bank. We have Helen Moutford, who's the Vice President for Climate and Economics at the World Research Institute, and also the Program Director for the incredibly important New Climate Economy Project. We have Ahmed Qabany, who's the Manager of Climate Change Division at the Islamic Development Bank, who's been doing fantastic work, including getting them to issue a green sukuk. And we have Mark Fulton, who's Chair of the Carbon Tracker Initiative's Research Council and the Program Coordinator of the Inevitable Policy Response under the umbrella of the Principles for Responsible Investment. Our session is how to win the transition challenge. I'm going to ask Nancy to kick us off. Over to you, Nancy.
Thank you very much, Sean. Can you hear me?
Beautifully.
Okay, so I'm just going to start very quickly by saying hello to everybody. I'm sorry we can't see one another, but I'm delighted to be here on behalf of the European Investment Bank. I've put this first slide, and I'll come back to why, but I wanted to explain who the European Investment Bank are very briefly. We are owned by the 27 EU member states, and we are now the EU's climate bank, but we are also a global multilateral development bank and work with all the other MDBs around the world. We lend money across the world in developing countries as well as all over the EU to private and public borrowers. And also we invest in funds, we support SMEs. So what you see in front of you is our very ambitious 2019 commitments. And I want to highlight that there's two aspects to this, because when we talk about the green transition, we need to talk about the two sides of the coin. You can see that the first two are about doing a lot more in climate action and environmental sustainability. And this is absolutely essential. We need to drive more money, and we all need to do this within our own organizations. We need to put more money into what really helps solve the climate and environment problem. That's the green finance, and we need to accelerate it. We need to make sure it's really robustly defined, as Sean said, and we need to mobilize private money for it, but we need to do a lot more of it. But the third bullet is terribly important, and you see the part about the stopping the support of traditional fossil fuel investments in the fourth point. This is about doing less of what really undermines the climate and environment agenda. This is about Paris alignment, some call it. You might call it doing significant harm. Whatever it is, it's about driving finance inevitably and more swiftly away from those activities which we need to just disinvest from. And the bank has put these two very important sides of the coin into its commitments. As you can see right at the end, very important, as Sean said, we have to remember that climate change is built in already, whatever we do in the future. So we've got to continue adapting to the changing climate. And very importantly, if we don't address it being a just and socially fair transition, we will not get there either. Next slide. Next slide, thank you. So again, it doesn't really matter what years you see on the top of this diagram or what the figures are. What matters is the shape of the curves. The longer we delay, and we have been delaying for quite a long time, the harder it gets to limit greenhouse gas emissions to what we have to do. And the IPCC, International Panel on Climate Change, have made it very clear we need to be targeting 1.5 degrees centigrade, not just to avoid massive impacts on millions of people and on nature, but also, very importantly, because many scientists believe that 2 degrees is no longer a safe target. There is a real risk of runaway, unmanageable climate change. So the curve shows that the longer we leave it, the steeper the curve has to get. And unfortunately, the more likely we are to overshoot. And at the bottom, it doesn't show you, but you can imagine an overshoot of greenhouse gas emissions that we have to pull back. At the moment, we really only have two possible ways of getting CO2 out of the atmosphere. That's planting more trees, having better and healthier forests, and also perhaps carbon capture and storage and other carbon sinks. At the moment, we do not have that at scale, so we cannot afford to overshoot. We need to drop emissions as fast as we can. And in many sectors, we can do that already. It's absolutely essential that wherever there is a low carbon technology, we drive money towards that, because there are many sectors where we still need to work out what the transition pathway is. And we will need a bit more time for those. Next slide, please. And in case anybody is sitting around thinking that this is mainly being discussed by NGOs, this is the World Economic Forum 2020 risk report. And for the first time this year, the top 5 outlook risks in terms of likelihood are environmental. The very top one is extreme weather, as Sean was talking about. You can see in impact terms, again, very, very high levels of impact from climate change and biodiversity loss and extreme weather. But it is important to note that biodiversity loss. Next slide, please. Because when we're talking about climate change, we have to remember that there's another existential threat facing us. And this is really making it into a dual planetary emergency. We have a climate and environmental emergency. We are losing ecosystems, natural capital, and species at an incredible rate. And this is our world. This is the ocean and the nature that we need to have clean air, clean water, and of course, our food. And if the nature isn't healthy, it cannot help deal with climate change. So we need to tackle these two together. Next slide, please. Now, I tried to find a more up-to-date version of the planetary boundaries, but one thing you can see from this slide is that climate change, we are still, we are over the good limit, but we're still not into the catastrophic danger. We're approaching it very fast, though, which is why we have to transition so quickly. But look at biogeochemical and look at the biosphere. We are way, way, way beyond any planetary boundary. So remember that when we start talking about solutions. We cannot bet on nature while we're at the same time undermining it. We need to support that at the same time as we need to reduce emissions very dramatically in this decade, not another decade, this decade. So coming back to what I said about the bank at the beginning, you may be from different organizations, but whatever it is you're doing, you need to be very ambitious, you need to act with urgency, and you need to address both parts. That is, doing more of what really helps, a taxonomy person might call it substantial contribution, and doing less, disinvesting, moving away, whatever it is you call it, in the parts that cause significant harm, in the investments and the activities which are still emitting and which are undermining all the other climate change efforts. And so I'm going to hand over now to the rest of the panel and hope we have a really good debate. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. Fantastic. I want to bring in Helen Moutford now, who's been working on the New Climate Economy project ever since she was lured from the OECD, which has been a project to look at what the future looks like, what the economy needs to look like going forward, and what the challenges are for us. But Helen, you've got a particular approach you want to tackle. Go ahead. Please leave the PowerPoints back to where they were, folks.
Thanks very much, Sean. And all this is an incredibly timely and important conference to be having. This is exactly what we need to be discussing now and advancing. And I'd also like to congratulate Nancy and all her colleagues in the European Investment Bank for their leadership on these issues, not just recently, but over a number of years. It's really important what you're doing, and excellent to see that leadership. Thank you. This decade will be critical for the future of both humanity and the planet. And the COVID-19 crisis really underscores the urgency of this challenge, providing a wake-up call to all of us on the importance of climate action and doing so inclusively. But the decisions that we make over the next 3 to 18 months will be especially critical as we recover from this crisis. Globally, we've seen governments have already committed an unprecedented almost $12 trillion to combat COVID-19 and boost the economy. This is more than 3 times the amount committed in response to the 2008-2009 financial crisis. So significant amounts. We've not seen this kind of investment before. And these investments can either help accelerate the low carbon transition, the inclusive, resilient transition, or they can lock us into a dangerous, high emitting pathway full of future risks as we go forward. So it's an opportunity for us now not only to restart the world economy, but actually to reset it onto a new and much more resilient and low carbon pathway. And the good news is that actually the evidence demonstrates that low carbon interventions, now more resilient interventions, can actually lead to better economic results in the short and the long term. So for example, we've seen that according to the IEA and IMF, investing $1 million now in renewable energy, in building efficiency, or clean urban transport could create more than twice as many jobs as investing the same amount in coal or gas power. Similarly, when we look back at the 2009 stimulus, in the US, we saw that each dollar spent on public transport infrastructure created 70% more job hours than a dollar spent on highway infrastructure. So these are not only better for the climate, better for air pollution and our health, but actually also better at generating the jobs we so desperately need coming out of the crisis. And through some of the work we've been doing at the World Resources Institute and with the New Climate Economy project that Sean mentioned, we've actually seen mounting evidence of this in countries around the world, showing that low carbon and climate resilient growth paths can be better than the traditional business as usual paths we've all been following. So let me just highlight briefly two specific examples from some of the work we've been doing. First, a very recent report we released through our Brazil team shows that a low carbon and resilient economic recovery in Brazil could actually deliver the economic benefits that they're needing starting immediately. By 2030, over time, it would result in a net increase of more than 2 million jobs. That's 4 times more jobs than already existing in Brazil's oil and gas industry, compared to business as usual growth, returning to that sort of growth. And we could get a GDP gain of something like $535 billion, equivalent to the annual GDP today of Belgium. And this is all through practical approaches that can be implemented today in Brazil in terms of the industrial shift, in terms of actually harnessing the power of the natural resources they have there, protecting and conserving those for future use. Second example is in Indonesia, where the Indonesian Ministry of Planning has identified a low carbon growth pathway, which the government has been integrating into its economic development plans for 2020 to 2024. Again, what they found was this low carbon path would outstrip business as usual growth from the very first year. And by 2045, the 100th year anniversary of Indonesian independence, the benefits could include more than 15 million additional jobs, which are greener and better paid, GDP gains, considerable GDP gains compared to business as usual, but also regional and gender benefits as well, in terms of creating the economy of the future and one which is better for all. The Indonesian government is now updating these scenarios to reflect the latest on the COVID economic baseline and planning to use these actively as part of their efforts to design an economic recovery in Indonesia. So there's important examples of where we're seeing this evidence. But despite this, most of the COVID-19 stimulus so far has not been very green, according to tracking by Vivid Economics and others. There's some notable exceptions, particularly in the European Union, with the UK, and some important measures in South Korea, in Canada, and a few other countries. But on balance, it's not looking great. One study finds that only 4 of the G20 nations are committing more public money to clean energy than they are to fossil fuels. Overall, countries, over 50% of the money that countries have pledged to the energy sector has actually gone to fossil fuels, compared to only 35% for clean energy in terms of the economic stimulus. And the remaining is for other energy purposes. But on balance, we're still providing too much in terms of stimulus and support for fossil fuels rather than clean energy, despite all the benefits that we know clean energy systems can bring. And one of the things that we are seeing, and we'll discuss further today, is it's not just the climate imperative, it's not just the employment and economic benefits of this transition that are important, but we're also seeing important shifts in terms of private finance, in terms of demand for fossil fuels, and recent price volatility around oil and gas, which are sending a very strong signal now to decision makers, policymakers, investors, that it is time to shift away from fossil fuels and really build towards a clean and resilient and inclusive future economy. We need to avoid the future risks and future shocks. Otherwise, it's simply too risky. So a couple of very brief points on this. We've seen in terms of market shifts, private finance and insurance companies have already decisively moved away from coal. There's simply no future for coal in terms of the private investments, and any governments that are starting to move in that direction are really putting at risk these investments in terms of future stranded assets. So something that we'd suggest they all rethink. Sean also mentioned the support we're seeing in the private sector in terms of financial disclosure through the TCFD work, but we're also seeing investors moving, for example, to come together. We had 70 global investors coming together recently to develop a net zero investment framework, providing a blueprint for investors to really tackle climate change moving forward. Second, I mentioned the shifting demand for fossil fuels. We're seeing a much more rapid transition to electric vehicles than any of the experts expected, growing faster than anyone could imagine. And it's just the tip of the iceberg in terms of some of the electrification we're seeing in the system, which enables that shift away from fossil fuels. And a number of countries are now already committing to invest even more in EV infrastructure as part of their economic recovery. So they're going to be accelerating this trend further. So we're going to see quite a shift there. We're also seeing some countries that are starting to talk about the importance of moving away from inefficient and expensive fossil fuel subsidies, the $478 billion each year provided in fossil fuel subsidies around the world. Now, this is important. It's going to be important as we come out of the crisis and the recovery for countries to actually balance their budgets. They're going to need to cut these inefficient subsidies. But it's also going to be important in terms of shifting some of the demand for fossil fuels. Once you remove these artificially low prices for fossil fuels, you will see a shift in demand. Nigeria has already started. They've committed to reforming and removing their fossil fuel subsidies, and others will follow. Third, in terms of price volatility, what we've seen is that the historic drop in oil prices this spring to negative prices briefly, which we've never seen before, has really woken up leaders in a number of the oil and gas rich countries. They've recognized just how risky it is to rely on these assets for their future economic development and the importance of much greater economic diversification. This is the moment for investors and for countries and for the multilateral and regional development banks to get behind them and to support them on that economic diversification strategy rather than doubling down on these risky fossil fuels. And finally, as we already indicated, this is also the way forward. The energy transition is needed to actually deliver the jobs that we want. IRENA has found that investing in transforming the energy system could actually quadruple renewable energy jobs to 42 million, could lead to employment gains in energy efficiency to 21 million employees, and add 15 million in terms of system flexibility. So it's really the moment not only for the climate, but also for economic growth, for social prosperity, and for equity to move forward with this, not just this decisive decade, but actually a truly decisive recovery from the economic and health and social crisis of COVID-19 to a pathway that's more clean, efficient, equitable, and sustainable. We have the opportunity. It's now up to us to seize it. Let's make the right choices. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. Such fantastic finishing words. Thank you for that presentation. And also thank you for the work you and your team have been doing, which has been so important for the rest of us working on climate change and climate finance over the last few years. Now I want to shift to Ahmed Al-Qabany, my good friend in Jeddah, who has been working with two kinds of members, the huge number of members of the Islamic Development Bank in vulnerable states, as well as those with fossil fuel economies. Ahmed, over to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Sean, and thank you so much for the invitation. I'm happy to be here, although from an almost empty office here at the headquarters in Jeddah. It's quite interesting actually speaking with my fellow panelists, and I'll just split my opening, let's say, remarks to two parts to pave the way for the discussion after. So the first is I want to present how the world is evolving from this perspective of ISDB member countries as you see them in the regions we operate, and how our engagement with these countries have been evolving over the past few years. And the second part is how we're working on supporting these countries' green transition, our member countries' green transition, and what we think we should be doing more of moving forward for a successful transition. So the first part, I always like using the bank itself as an example, if you want to see how things have been evolving very quickly. So the bank itself is a multilateral development bank, and we have 57 member countries who have been in operation for over 45 years, actively supporting the development of these member countries, almost active in all of them, one way or the other. So if you look at the map, all the way from Suriname and Guyana west, and then all the way to Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Malaysia. And so very different countries geographically, socioeconomic development, GDP. We have some large oil producers, resource rich, and some are considered as least developed countries. So quite diverse. Now, the bank is a clear demonstration of the changing winds. So for example, we've been doing climate financing for many years. However, the climate change division at the bank has only been around for 3 years. So similar to how MDBs operate, we have been doing those climate operations in a less structured way, less targeted way, and mainly demand or request driven as MDBs sometimes used to operate. However, with the transformation that happened in the bank and following the Paris Agreement, it was very clear that with the ambitions and expectations growing from the member countries and with the massive challenge, the climate response could not be ad hoc anymore. And just to show the change, the shift in the thinking of all these countries, who most of them are considered from the global south, when we were discussing our first climate change policy in late 2018, early 2019, submitting it to the board, a lot expected there would be resistance. However, there was overwhelming support from the board members representing the countries you see on the map. And one thing that was quite interesting, and it needs to be highlighted here, is that when we were doing our consultations, 95% of the member country stakeholders or respondents identified resilience as a key priority that the bank should actively focus on. Moreover, when we're thinking of our climate target, similar to our fellow MDBs, we set our first climate change finance target as 35% at least by 2025. So we do expect to be even doing much more on that. Now, you see here the changing winds. Now, there are key considerations for us when we talk about climate action. Now, in addition to the key global trends that mentioned high population growth, high levels of urbanization, our member countries, you see them, increasing energy use, increasing energy demand, water demand, and implications of food security, mobility needs. Our member countries were really behind in terms of infrastructure, with very, very large infrastructure needs. So in the context of SDGs, as an MDB that works mainly for the development of their countries, we were already behind. And the majority of our member countries, if not all of them, have been relatively low emitters. So one of the key objectives here is not just reducing emissions, which is applicable in some cases, but it's about driving growth, driving development, and remaining as low emitters on low carbon development pathways. So the key thing for us here, and this is something that needs to be brought forward, is how can we decouple growth from increasing emissions? Now, some developed countries have managed to do this successfully, but in our part of the world, and many of the developing countries, still more capacity building, technology transfer, awareness need to be done. So for example, if we were to address the efficiency in low energy access in sub-Saharan Africa, high energy intensity in MENA, Central Asia, or low energy efficiency, we need to address this while staying on a low carbon trajectory. Same applies for transport, urban development, and so on and so forth for agriculture infrastructure. Now, this also raises a very important question, and I'm happy to be speaking after Helen in this case. What are our country's low carbon development pathways? How do we contextualize our interventions to support investments in industries that are on the low carbon development pathways of our member countries? The problem is most of the models we see are done at a global level or on developed country perspective. So it's quite a challenge for us to contextualize our interventions in our member countries to ensure growth and remain on a low carbon trajectory. The other thing is how to ensure just transition. You've been talking about available technologies. They're not available everywhere, not on all sectors. So how to ensure just transition? And this is something we're working on with our other partner MDBs and development agencies. Now, another key area to flag is the resilience, which you kindly highlighted at the very beginning, Sean. The resilience is a key consideration. We cannot undermine how important this, overemphasize, sorry, how important this is. Look at the map, you'll see that we have some of the most vulnerable countries in the world, maybe from food security, water scarcity in sub-Saharan Africa, MENA region, extreme weather events, Southeast Asia and Central Asia. We have vulnerable countries. So we need to ensure that all of our interventions, we cannot have the discussion on green transition without ensuring that all interventions in our member countries are actually resilient. So without taking much longer, it's been extremely interesting to see the growing interest from our country stakeholders in this dialogue and how to contextualize. I could give you example from our largest shareholder, host country, Saudi Arabia, which is Vision 2030, how they've identified the circular carbon economy as one of the methods to go to this green or green development. With focusing on focusing on carbon capture and storage. Although they have a 30% renewable energy target, they still think of oil as part of their formula. We saw the United Arab Emirates, their Green Agenda program. So Egypt, Morocco, with their ambitious renewable energy targets. And I actually had statistics from Indonesia as probably the only country that has low carbon development initiative. And I had the same statistics that Helen actually had: 6% GDP growth, 43% emission reduction, and the over 50 million jobs. And it's worth flagging here that this is one of 57 countries that have so clearly identified this low carbon development pathway. It's not as easy for others. So for us to, as the Multilateral Development Bank, working with others, we need to actually start with that. How do we support those, identifying those pathways that are suited to low carbon, that are resilient? And most importantly now, and relevant to the discussions after, how to mobilize private finance, how to bring in investors. Our sovereign financing, our lending is not enough, nowhere near enough, even collectively as multilateral development banks. What we need is we need to enable the financial flows, private financial investors, to go into these economies transition or developing economies and support this development. How do we mobilize this private sector? Even internally, we're working on updating investment criteria, even direct investment and through FIs. And we're trying to bring in more Islamic financial institutions and mobilize green Islamic finance. As you mentioned, Sean, we just issued our first green sukuk issuance of 1 billion euros. And we have many of our MDB partners to thank, for helping lead the way, EIB, EBRD, and others with our treasury department. And now we're thinking of off-balance sheet mobilization, blended finance, crowd financing platforms, our energy colleagues for sub-Saharan Africa for renewable energy. So we need to be innovative. We need to think out of the box, but at the same time, we really need to be thinking with the private sector, what they need, and how can we prepare more green deals, as mentioned by Nancy, how can we bring more green deals to the market, enable preparation of more green bankable projects in the region to enable the overall development of our member countries. Technology transfer is key, South-South cooperation is key, and I think we believe that all actors working together is the only way to really achieve the green transition in such a pressing time. With that, I'll stop and I'll pass on to you, Sean and Mark, and I look forward to continuing the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ahmed. You said a couple of very interesting things, both on the resilience, on the blended finance aspect, and a little taste of things like the Saudi plan, 30% renewables target and a circular carbon economy project. These are things the rest of the world I don't think appreciates in terms of what's going on here. Change is happening everywhere, folks. But of course, it's the resilience agenda we have to get right for your member states. And that is so urgent at the moment. I want to now pass to Mark Fulton, who's chair of the Carbon Tracker Initiative Research Council. He's also, by the way, a Climate Bonds senior advisor. And he's been working on this project called the Inevitable Policy Response for the Principles for Responsible Investment and UNEP FI and others recently. Mark, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you very much. And hello from sunny Sydney. I don't know if you quite see the backdrop I put together of the sunny harbour, which I cheated from this morning. But anyway, so I'd like to, thanks, Sean. I'd like to talk a bit about this inevitable policy response. It was commissioned by the PRI. And apart from my own group, we've got Vivid Economics doing the modelling. We've got Carbon Tracker involved. We've got Grantham on the just transition and the 2DI investing as well. So we've got a group of us that have come together to look at what we're calling the inevitable policy response. Well, people often say to me, there's only two things that are inevitable, the famous death and taxes. But in this case, I actually think it is inevitable that policymakers are forced to respond to the climate crisis. The only question is what and when. And so that's, unfortunately, for financial markets, that's the issue. Now, what we wanted to do in this particular project is to look at it from an investor's standpoint as almost a forecast. Going back to my old days as a investment bank research head and strategist, what do we really think is going to happen in this context of this push for 1.5, and how severe really should the mainstream investor think this is coming? In other words, it's all very well to say, yeah, it's really nice. Yeah, we're doing stuff, but no, will it really impact what you're doing? So that's what we set out to explore. So on the next slide, next, yeah. So do the investors agree with us? Well, we did 2 of these surveys, one in September 2018 when we launched it, and one in September 29, consistent answers. 2/3 of investors expect a disorderly, disruptive policy response. That's what they think's coming at them. We did try and find the one investor who thought it was actually on now, but they wouldn't own up to it. So this is a fairly consistent response, and this would correspond to the NGFS too late, too little box. So on the next slide. So what will really drive it? Why are we so confident? Well, the point is we call these momentum-based drivers. We've got the lower costs of renewable energy. We all talk about that. And generally, it's all getting cheaper. And that's very important for policymakers. You don't want to drive something too expensive at the economy all the time. So this time, this stuff is getting a lot cheaper and a lot more efficient. We know that businesses are asking for more. Regulators are asking for more. The insurance industry is getting a bit desperate. There's lots of research coming out telling us that if we don't do this, we're in trouble. We know there are lots of security implications for everyone at a national security level. And basically, you know, there are these big targets that are now coming. So on the next page, I think, though, these are the ones that we think really drive what's going on. We think people are noticing. I always love a Murdoch, the world's on fire from the sun. And that was a couple of years back, but I could have 100 more of those by now. And of course, we see civil society, Greta's there, and that's the key. There is a massive push going on into the political arena. So we come to one of the most interesting moments in time looming in the next 2 or 3 months. The US leadership polls say a close race for now. I think that's the way to put it. But I think there's going to be a very important, there's no doubt, we all know, if Biden wins and the Senate turns Democrat, we're going to have IPR priced. If he doesn't win, it's going to take longer. So I think this is a very important moment in the very short run, but not in the medium term. So on the next page. So basically what we did is we said, we used the Paris Agreement ratchet sort of a setting. And we said that by the 2025 ratchet, that this pressure coming on the policymakers will be inexorable and they will have acted. The US election, the Chinese 5-year plan, we'll get 2 of them, and the global emissions stock take in 2023 when we all realize we're in big trouble. So I think that we believe that by 2025 ratchet, you're going to see very significant policy enacted. Next slide. So I'm actually not going to go into the policies because there's 130 pages of them on the website. Please do go. There's 350 pages of research. There's a lot of policies, but simply put, what does that policy reaction lead to? Is it significant? That's the point. And we think so. We think, you know, oil will peak by 2028. This is pre-COVID, of course. Thermal coal's pretty much gone out of the system by 2040 due to bans on and reductions in coal build. Solar and wind are generating half electricity by 2030. Electricity is electrified inside 20 years, and land use, we do a lot of work on land use, is heavily impacted. However, that is not enough to hit 1.5 degrees, and we're very upfront about that. So what I'm saying to you, if you really want to hit 1.5 degrees, you have got to go massively more than any of us that look at sort of normal policy forecasting can see at the moment. Next slide. And that shows up here. This shows you what what an NDC would look like, the dotted orange line, so that's a disaster. We see the blue dotted line as IEA's SDS, and we see our line, the so-called IPR forecast policy scenario, coming down as we get through the 2020s into the 2030s after this policy ratchet's enacted, but and staying slightly above SDS. Now, if you want to get to 1.5 on the strictest definition of the IPCC's P1 definition, you can just see how much overshoot we're coming to. So all I would say is that in our world, we believe negative emissions technologies have to be looked at, are important. We'll start with land use, we'll start with forestry, we'll start with afforestation, but we're certainly going to need some type of CCS. We're going to need a lot, everything we've got, all of the above, if we're going to get anywhere near that in this view. So we believe, although we don't show 1.5, it's still possible, but we wanted to do an exercise that focused on the 2020s, said this is realistic, but there's much further to go. Next slide. So does this 2020 shock have much effect? Yeah, I think so. We modeled this at quite a deep level, Vivid did. In the equities market, the spread is from a reduction of 10% to an increase of 3%. Some of the sectors fall 30%. You can guess that's oil and gas. Infrastructure looks very interesting. Green infrastructure looks very promising. You know, high carbon infrastructure going to get killed. So the switches here are big. Real estate, we've heard about that. Lots of opportunity. And private equity, we think, will be important. Our bond numbers don't look so big because if you model it on a 5-year, you know, the ability of bonds to turn over every 5 years allows them to escape a bit, but it's a bit misleading. We believe that people will wish to signal in sovereign debt what they think to sovereigns, and they also will want to invest in corporate bonds. That'll be a real capital flow. And one of the big ideas that we continue to push, not big, it's obvious, is you need to switch into green assets. The simplest thing an optimizer would do with this is to sell carbon heavy equities and invest them in real green assets. And it's this sort of thing that we think investors need to look far more at. Next slide. So can you engage? Yes, you can engage. Can you construct your portfolio? Yes, you can. We're focused on portfolio construction, but we know people will engage. Next slide. So what should you do? Well, the first thing, if you're an asset owner, we think it really is a wake-up call. You've got to get out there. You've got to get out of the red. You've got to look at possible divestment, tilting your portfolios, changing your manager universe. You've got to look going into the green boxes, looking for credible transition plans. And I think Sean's conference is going to talk a lot about transition plans. They're very, very important. They're the new thing we'll all be analyzing. We need new benchmarks. And we need active action. Next slide. So as a result of this, I think at the end of the day, we think portfolios will actively change in this direction. They will green across the whole of the asset classes, but I think we're going to see more shift ultimately into the infrastructure, real asset classes, where you can have real economic inputs. Thank you.
Mark, thank you. What a project you created here. Such an important piece of work for guiding us. We've had a few interesting questions come in. I'm going to start with you and then go to a few other places. So folks, this is the panel session. Because we've got questions from the audience, we're going straight there. GDP, in your modeling, what are you seeing around GDP development going green versus heavy emissions pathways relatively we're on now? I mean, is this shift a great news story for GDP, particularly for emerging markets, or is it more complicated than that?
Well, look, overall GDP I always thought was rather ridiculous because, you know, you get a shift of 1 to 2% in global GDP levels by 2050 plus, which is about 0.1% a year, which is less than the statistical error on the accounts. So I've never quite wondered why everyone was so jumping up and down about it, myself as an economist. So take a long run view, this is, you know, globally. Then of course there are winners and losers. Like the whole story of investment in climate change is winners and losers, really. And you've got to go with the winners and you've got to be careful of the losers. And of course, this is a great challenge to fossil fuel dependent countries. You know, Ahmed's, you know, there are people that are going to be challenged, and that's why they need to move fast now while they've got the cash flow. They need to get ready to really re-engineer their economies. But when you look at the OECD, there is very little impact of note, in our opinion. And when you look at emerging markets, yes, there's a little bit more. And then as you go down into the fossil fuel dependence a bit more, but these are quite passing events. And the reality is that most of the models find it hard to model GDP, in my opinion. And I suspect the surprise will be that we see a more positive GDP outlook than the models currently generate.
Fantastic. So going back to then fossil fuel countries, picking up that point, what does a macroeconomic or an economic shift plan look like from the perspective you're doing? I mean, we heard a little bit about Ahmed with Saudi 2030 vision, but what's it looking like from your perspective? You've been looking at this for so long.
Well, I think there's no doubt you have to look at what the winners are. And if you've got, you're going to have to shift towards renewable energy, you're going to have to shift towards green infrastructure, the hydrogen economy. There are so many opportunities. I mean, my own country, Australia, I mean, honestly, they could re-engineer their massive carbon exports into green exports. Really, it could be done. There's so much opportunity to get into the new commodities, as you might call them. So
we've lost your audio, Mark. For a moment, briefly. I'll go to Ahmed. Yeah. Ahmed, can you pick up that question of what this change looks like and what you see as the steps that are being taken? Again, you started on this question earlier for countries in achieving a transition.
So, as I said, I think each country needs to look in its own context how it could make the best use out of resources. So we have many oil producing countries looking into industry. So one of the things, for example, that we noticed Saudi Arabia is doing, again, not to keep using it as an example, but they also want to industrialize and produce in-house the solar panel production. So they're looking into industries and supporting the whole supply chain and how much they could benefit from that. Again, UAE is looking into diversifying the economy. We're looking at countries like Nigeria. You just mentioned Kazakhstan, how they're moving and transitioning, diversifying. I think the key word for them here is diversification, economy diversification. And even for Saudi Arabia, they're looking into, for example, having products of added value. So not just, core oil and gas industries, but how petrochemical industry, plastics, and moving into that and identifying, let's say, a low carbon form of that. That suits their development needs and that fits within the overall IEA models. And this is how they've taken up this to diversify the economy. And we see many countries, similar countries, using the same path. So other oil producers, for example, are looking into the competitiveness of PV solar energy. You mentioned some of, two of the cheapest, utility scale solar plants are here in the region, which adds to the competitiveness. So instead of exporting or using instead of using internally for energy production, they could use PV utility scale plants. So it needs to be localized. You need to look at the local economy and contextualize it. So it's quite difficult to generalize. It's quite difficult to compare, let's say, Nigeria, Kazakhstan, UAE, Saudi Arabia. And this is the thing, and this is what I was trying to flag here. Those models need to look into the different countries and how each country can identify its own pathway. And this is the challenge now for us, to identify the key investments where we should be putting our focus.
And of course, it's also the opportunity because we have capital wanting to go into these areas. Helen, you've been doing a lot of modeling, particularly in emerging markets, about what the economic future should look like. What do you think about this comment about macroeconomic strategy, industrial strategy, as picked up by Mark and Ahmed in the question?
Thanks very much, Sean. And I agree 100% with what Ahmed says there. There's a lot of opportunities for diversification, understanding exactly what that might mean in a specific country circumstance. It does require targeted modeling, but actually beyond that, it requires a lot of engagement and discussion with the investors, the business community, civil society, government, to help chart that path and look at what's realistic. And that's really what we've been helping support do in a number of countries now. I mean, we cited the Indonesia and the Brazil results, but Ethiopia is doing a very similar exercise as they go into looking at their next 5-year economic development plan and their first ever 10-year economic development plan. Colombia, we're working with some provinces in China around the Yangtze River Basin. Various countries are starting to look at what does this really mean for them, and the more we can do that, the better. Mark is absolutely right, and I have to say, on the economic models, I also very much agree with him. I think one of the things that has been said before is that, economic projections, we know the one thing about the economic models and economic projections is that they will always be wrong. On the other hand, some of them are useful, right? And so what we're looking is where are they useful and how to do that. And I think one of the things that a number of institutions have been trying to do, and we've been supporting this certainly in our work, I think some of the work of the IPR is also trying to do the same, is how do we actually, we know there's a lot of limitations of these models. They've often not reflected climate impacts. They've often not reflected some of the benefits of things like energy efficiency or better resource efficiency in terms of land use, the pollution effects, those haven't been reflected. And what we've been trying to do is actually adjust the models to reflect the reality on the ground. And when you do, you find that actually there are these strong economic and social benefits of action. So there is a lot there. I think one of the challenges that was raised by Ahmed, and I know Nancy and EIB, they've done a lot there, is the challenge of this just transition. For as you're going forward, there are going to be some winners and losers. Overall, this is a better approach for the economy, for society, more inclusive, better, stronger growth, more sustainable. But how do you actually ensure that those communities, those workers whose sectors may be declining, as we need to do going forward, how do we actually ensure they're taken care of, that they're brought along to new opportunities? And I think that's somewhere where we really need the policymakers to focus now, is ensuring that just and fair transition for workers and communities who are going to be negatively affected. There's great opportunities for others in the new economy, whether it's renewable energy or new industries or new sectors. There's a lot of opportunities there, but for those who are in the more traditional sectors who've really powered our economies in the past, how do we bring them along and ensure there's an opportunity for them as well?
Helen, who's doing well? Who are your, give us a couple of good examples of economies that are beginning to tackle this successfully. I mean, no one's perfect, we understand that, but just to give us a sense of who's advancing. Are you willing to share?
I can give you a couple of examples from what we're seeing from the COVID-19 economic recovery, which I think is really very interesting. I mean, we've certainly seen in the European Union and the UK, I think they've been really the front runners. The European Union, for example, has agreed that not only its economic recovery, but its next 7-year budget, 30% of this will be directed towards climate action, and the rest will be consistent with or Paris aligned. Consistent with climate action. So I think that's really showing leadership. South Korea is a really exciting example. They invested by far the most, or committed the most, in the 2007-2008 financial crisis towards green stimulus. They were also one of the countries that bounced back the quickest amongst OECD countries. So very heavily green, fairly quick recovery. They're also committing now to a very strong green recovery. Like with many, including Europeans, there's also some signals which are inconsistent with that, you know, some support for industries that are heavily based on coal, etc. Canada is an exciting one. There's again, mixed signals, some strong fossil fuel support, some not. But one of the points in Canada, which I think is particularly interesting, is that for some of the economic stimulus that they're providing to major companies, what they've said is, we will only do this if you commit to disclosing your climate-related impacts and on an annual basis. So basically requiring TCFD-like disclosure as part of the recovery package. If you're going to get the money, you've got to do the disclosure and you've got to set targets on climate. So I think that's interesting. But in most countries, to be frank, we're seeing a little bit of a mix. And unfortunately, one of the things that happens very quickly right at the start is that everyone's trying to bail out the industries that are really most affected by COVID, whether it's aviation or some of the fossil fuels. And so countries leapt straight into bailing out some of these industries, which probably are ones that really need to transition and shift over this period. And there's an opportunity to get them to shift, but where we saw unconditional bailouts at the start, it's hard then to go back and say, oh, and by the way, we'd like you to also do this and to shift this way and to support your workers and make sure it moves smoothly. So there's a risk there for some of the early bailouts. We're hoping as we go forward, other countries will learn from that experience. I would mention there have also been, just briefly, a few countries which have really come forward during this period and actually enhanced their climate commitments. So they've actually stepped up their national development contributions, their nationally determined contributions on climate action. And this includes, for example, Chile, it includes Rwanda. There's a few more who in the last few months have actually said, as part of our recovery, we want to step up our climate action. And so that's been exciting as well.
Heroes of climate change. Nancy,
Sean,
you've got a question, but I want to give you a question as well. Go ahead.
Okay. All right. So what I just wanted to add on, how things are moving very fast. The EIB, we have been doing a public stakeholder engagement on our Climate Bank roadmap, which is how we put those things that were on the first slide really into the actions that we're taking. And there was a great deal of feedback of the importance of focusing not just on the actual investments, but on the companies or the entities that are making the investments. And I think that it is a very important and very fast changing field. And I think, EIB has always been a project bank. And this is a change that's quite challenging for us, but it was overwhelming feedback in the public feedback. That is, you can see it in our energy lending policy also from last year, that now, regardless of what the project is, even if it's a wind farm or whatever it is, we will be looking for energy companies, for power utilities to provide us with their decarbonisation plan. And I foresee, we still have to take our Climate Bank roadmap to the board, but there was a lot of requests for this to be widened out to all sorts of emitting industries, so that even if the actual investment is green, you also need to look at how the whole company, whether they're public or private entity, is planning to make this urgent transition and what they're going to be doing around that investment, what other investments they're making. And I think that is a really big thing that's happening very fast, and I think will create really a need for us to share experience on what are good decarbonisation plans and what do we expect, and very importantly, how do we monitor and report on that, so it's not just company or the public utility reduce emissions really urgently over time.
Great point. I've got another question for you, Nancy. Something you and I were discussing yesterday: gas, methane, natural gas. What role what does it have to play in this transition going forward? We've had a lot of questions on WOBA about this.
Okay. Well, I think the best thing is just to tell you how we've approached this at the bank. What we've done is taken a sort of fuel neutral approach. We've set so two things, as I said. First of all, you have to decide what you're going to proactively support that really helps. And we've had climate finance targets for years. We've put that up now to 50% by 2025. We have harmonized definitions with the other MDBs. We've never counted greenfield fossil fuel as climate finance. It hasn't been in the MDB and IDFC harmonized common principles, not since 2012. So I don't think we're going to any of us start now. But what is important is you can still have energy efficiency in industries that are using fossil fuel and in industries that are using gas. And if you're making a substantial contribution, the question is that good enough? And so that's why you need these criteria to say, is this a substantial enough reduction? In which case we want to capture that. Now, what the bank has done, it has also set, as I said, a kind of bottom line, which is what we call our emissions performance standard. And it was approved by the board last November. It's now 250 grams per kilowatt hour. So if you're below 250 grams per kilowatt hour in your power plant, it's still eligible for finance by the bank. That doesn't mean we're going to call it climate finance, but it is eligible. If it's above 250 grams per kilowatt hour, our bank is choosing not to put its resources into that. That's the way we're looking at it. So do more of the renewable energy and low carbon, but then set a bar below which you say, okay, now if gas can get under 250, it can still be financed by the bank.
But it can't be financed as part of climate lending.
Well, only if it was actually, let's say, supposing let's choose the taxonomy number, 100 grams. Yep. If you had a combined heat and power that had some gas and maybe a great majority of renewable biomass, maybe they could get under 100. At the moment, I don't see any of that being counted as climate finance. But what's really important is, as I said, it wouldn't even be eligible for the bank if it doesn't meet 250.
So to be clear for the listeners, what the European Union taxonomy says, and Nancy and I were both intimately involved in that process, is that new unabated gas, or at least gas of an emissions threshold of above 100 grams of CO2 equivalent per kilowatt hour, requires your carbon capture and sequestration to get under that line, is not consistent with the climate investments we have to make in the future. That's the key point. So the window for gas as a transition in terms of new gas closed a few years ago. We used to think, we absolutely thought it was, but in 2018, especially when the IPCC 1.5 degree report came out and the international energy modeling around the Paris Agreement, it said, actually, to meet our climate targets, new unabated gas, well, as Fadi Birol said, who's the executive director of the International Energy Agency, there can be no new unabated fossil fuel investments if we are to meet those targets. So they do not, it just doesn't work. But we have a lot of complexity around what to do with the existing gas installation, which we need for a bit longer. We will need to run it down over the next 20 years. How we do that then becomes the challenges, and get emissions down without extending the life of the asset. I want to cut to Mark, who has a couple of ideas on this question. Mark, over to you.
Well, actually, what first I want to say is that on the just transition, there's no way we could forecast policy action of the extent we are doing without a lot of just transition with it, I can tell you. Anyway, so on gas, again, we're always a bit sort of like, well, okay, that's great. This is what we should do, but what might happen in terms of looking at the economics and the trends? Well, I think chasing gas out of the power sector is very doable on cost basis. Chasing it out of industry is another matter. It's obviously that the models like to switch coal to gas as the first abatement strategy in the hard to abate industrial sectors. So that's good, you know, but you still got gas. And in fact, we found it very, very hard in our modeling because we want to be, we're not climate constrained. We don't go, well, we got to get to 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees. Therefore, we go, well, this is what we think. What does that mean? What does that come out at? And so when we looked at it, the key, of course, is the hydrogen economy in the industrial sectors. You know, there's a great hope that the hydrogen economy is going to take off. And we've seen a lot of work, Systemic has done work and so on, that shows you that there could be a very strong hydrogen economy. But this is where I go back to policymakers. This is a new, you know, you need a little bit of help here, to put it mildly, right? So we need some good policy frameworks around hydrogen, and we need those fast. Now, I think the good news is that my view is that when the big oil and gas majors look to their transition plans, if they don't want to run themselves into the floor to zero, right, as they run off their fossil fuel upstream and downstream businesses, then if they want to redeploy their cash flow, and this is be interesting, I suspect, for the Gulf states too, the question is, how do you turn gas into hydrogen without creating a lot of carbon again? But that is where CCS comes in and so on. So I think this whole area of CCS with gas, what can we do with gas in terms of hydrogen economy? That would be an area, if I was Ahmed, if I was his guys, I'd be looking at that real close. And I think the big oil majors are looking at it. And I think, you know, therefore, can we turn? So I'll finish up by saying, wouldn't it be nice if our large incumbent carbon creating companies become the engine of the transition? Of course it would, right? So how do we do that? We do that by them looking at how they switch their capital flows. That's why in Carbon Tracker, we're obsessed with CapEx. How you have to run your CapEx down, you have to redeploy your CapEx, you have to take your investors with you to what appears to be lower return sectors to begin with, although after COVID in the last few years and having looked recently at the world's largest oil companies' return on equity, I don't think the return argument for oil and gas holds up too well. So I think that we are going to see this big shift taking place, and that's positive. But I tell you, it's you know, to get it done in the next 20 years even is really tough going. And that's why we tend to find, why in IPR do we seem to be overshooting all these more aggressive emissions targets? Well, we don't really in electricity and not so much in transport, but in the hard to abate industrial sectors, in the land use sectors where we do a huge amount of work in land use. These are the very hard sectors to get your arms around. Sean, now
Mark,
we've lost you. Oh, you're back. You're back.
Folks, thanks for coping with these technical difficulties. My wobbling earlier was because I was in a mobile at my hand because my computer failed, but we're getting there. Mark, we've got a whole session on Thursday looking at hydrogen, and we'll have people like Qabany from Aqua talking about the $2 billion green hydrogen deal he's signed in Saudi. And we're thinking, actually, it could be 10 years. So it'll be interesting to see what you think of that conversation with the players about that, because absolutely it's one of the pivots. One last question for you before I ask about emerging market opportunities from Ahmed and Helen. What would your advice to a state utility like Pemex be at this particular point?
Well, basically diversify. I think someone said that word. I mean, I'd basically be getting out fast unless you're the lowest cost producer on the planet. Now, because Saudi Arabia has a little bit of an advantage there, right? So, I mean, it's very plain in Carbon Tracker's work that oil does not disappear overnight by any means, even in a one. You know, it's going to be around, and the low-cost producers are the winners. And so they're going to have to manage their cost base, and the high-cost producers just do something else.
Yeah, as BP started doing. Okay, thank you. Ahmed, how can emerging markets get money for what they need to do? Tell us a bit more. You talked about blended finance before and so on, but we've had a lot of questions. About half our audience is from emerging markets today, and they're saying, okay, how do we get this money? How do we get what we need to make the transition?
I wish I had an answer, Sean. I really wish. I think this is the big question right now. And out of all the multilateral development banks, we have the least access to, let's say, concessional financing, because we're the newest comer to the whole climate discussion compared to the other multilaterals. And this is actually part of the big discussion right now. It is a whole building block on our joint MDB Paris alignment discussion, is mobilizing finance. For us, we think that, you know, it's not, blended finance is a key catalyst. It has a role to play, but more importantly, we need to be able to develop bankable projects without even the blended finance. And there are areas where we see room for that, but it's just the know-how. You know, we've been talking about energy, but where we talk about, for example, development, integrated urban development, you know, with the rates of urbanization that we see in those emerging economies. When you talk about transport, which is, you know, not easy to break through, but mass transit and public transport. But these are areas that we could mobilize private financing, and we could bring those investors and encourage investors to come here. And they have a huge potential in terms of the green transition. And in a sense, they require less concessional financing than usual. One of the things that we see, and it's related to this blended financing and the new facilities, is de-risking facilities and guarantees. I think this is something that has been coming a lot across, and we're trying to think from our end, Islamic financial tools to bring guarantees. We already have a guarantee facility. It's called Saich, Islamic Corporation for Insurance, and similar to the World Bank Group's MIGA, for example. But we haven't been able to work with them and develop targeted tools for climate action. And this is one of the areas we see a lot of discussions with our member countries, because this is, we believe this is one of the ways that we could bring in this private financing, especially in vulnerable sectors, by the way, where it's difficult to demonstrate results. So I know it's not very attractive to some of the investors, but agriculture infrastructure, for example, we believe some of the instruments that we have, you know, takaful insurance especially for at the local level, we need to bring in and try to bring in these de-risking facilities or insurance facilities to mobilize this financing. On another, also, just in speaking of that, this is one of the things that we're trying to bring in one of our crowdsourcing platforms in sub-Saharan Africa. We worked with a Swedish company, and we had a crowdsourcing platform. We started a relatively small scale. So in a sense, we're trying to bring in our financing to de-risk this platform and crowd in some financing from different investors. And so again, we're trying to, you know, use those different tools, and depending on the country, depending on the sector, but there are sectors that are easier than others. And there are ones that we don't need as much blended finance as much as we need to be able to design these projects and develop these bankable projects, like urban development, the housing sector, and mass transit, public transport.
And the link between property development and mass transit as MTR has been doing in Hong Kong. And it would be great to have a chance to work with you on that. Maybe we must pick up the conversation. For those who don't know what that is, this is where you do property development on top of the railway station. The Urban Transit Authority might do it. And you use the value gain from the property development to pay for the subway. Because subways or mass transit or bus rapid transit systems are often hard to pay with out of the revenues, usually hard to pay for. So there's these companion developments, green buildings too, on top of the transport. The stuff we can do, folks, in every city. And by the way, it's worth noting that every major city has substantial value accretion from the property sector. So this idea of capturing a slice of it to pay for infrastructure is very viable because of the increased wealth in major cities around the world. So the opportunity is kind of now, which has already been done in Tokyo in the 80s, around China in the last 20 years, and so on. So in many areas, we've got to look at the models, the financial viability models. Folks, we've got about 3 or 4 minutes left. Helen, opportunities for emerging markets from your perspective, or how we get the funding to do this massive agenda.
Thanks very much, Sean. Let me just mention 2 very specific examples that we've seen from the recent work in Brazil. And again, these are examples that came out in the report through multiple discussions with colleagues on the ground, business sector investors, government officials, the civil society. So one is just around electric vehicles and production of electric vehicles. There's and all the way through, you know, from the sort of batteries, the recharging stations, etc. There's a lot of job opportunities there. In Brazil, there's a nascent industry there, and there's huge demand that is building around the region. So Brazil could really become a major provider of electric buses, electric vehicles in the region. So that's one where we saw a specific opportunity. A second one, and this builds on something Ahmed just said, a second one is really around green and nature-based infrastructure, investments there. What we've actually seen in Brazil is that some of the production, whether it's for cattle, livestock, for agricultural production, is not as efficient as it could be, not giving the returns that it needs to do, not being able to actually deliver the income for farmers. And one of the bad side effects of this means that farmers are then encroaching further and further onto natural areas, including in the Amazon or in other parts of Brazil. So those are at risk. Now, what we've seen is there's evidence that some agricultural intensification and improvement systems, including no-till farming, nitrogen fixation, etc., some things around cattle and livestock, could actually significantly increase crop yields or livestock production between 30% and 300% on the same land base, and therefore increase farmer incomes, you know, something like 3 or more times compared to what they are today. That also would reduce pressures on expansion into the Amazon, into forested areas, and to other areas of savanna. So these are really essential. We're seeing demand for these around the world. We've seen a lot of pressure from other countries in Europe. We've seen pressures from investors, from major agri producers to actually get Brazil to move away from deforesting in the Amazon. But we've also seen domestically within the country, there's a group of former finance ministers and central bank governors who came together and said, this really is the path for Brazil. We need to move away from this. It's too risky if we want to continue to have inward investment into Brazil and we want to have trade. Brazil's a major producer for the world in terms of agriculture and livestock. And to be able to maintain that position, they need to shift their practices in order to respond to some of these demands. But the good news is that actually doing so would actually be better for Brazil, better for its farmers, and better for Brazilians. So there's a real opportunity there that we identified, and others have done so for Brazil to make that kind of shift, which will help attract even more finance and investment into the country.
We're brimming with opportunities. Folks, in half an hour, we'll be launching our Financing Credible Transitions paper. You'll have to log on to a different WOVA page to do it. A last word from Nancy.
Yes, thank you. I just want to say that I think that there are plenty of investors out there who want to invest in green and green transition. I think there's actually plenty of money, as we've seen by being, you know, bonds being oversubscribed. The issue is we need to help public and private entities in developing countries as well as in developed countries, bring more projects through. And that also includes small businesses. So I know it's not really a bond thing, but I just want to talk about, you know, SMEs, micro and small and medium-sized enterprises, that banks can do so much to help them green. And so when we look at green finance, we've also got to remember not just the big infrastructure, but how can we support local banks to really help small businesses green as well.
Thank you, Nancy. And Mark, you want one word to go out. Go ahead.
The inevitable is coming. The policymakers will be driven to act. And if you guys don't get yourself ready, you'll be on the losing side. That's all I can say.
Thank you. What a fantastic panel. This will be recorded. Tell your friends. We'll come back to this. Now we're shutting off this panel and everyone's got time to get a cup of tea before coming back in half an hour. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Nancy. Thank you, Helen. Thank you, Ahmed, for joining us today. It's been fantastic.